back to your organization, Ardea Outcomes, because this is something that's quite interesting. It's not, well, one, you're in based in Nova Scotia, so that's maybe not the first place in the world people think of these an organization that's really pioneering this type of patient centric research. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about Ardea Outcomes and this concept of GAS, which is a goal attainment scaling.
Yeah, so the Nova Scotia link is really because Ken Rockwood is here. So I could go on and on and on about Dr. Rockwood, who's a dear friend and a mentor and a business partner and all those things. But he he has a global reach on several different levels. So he is a world-renowned geriatrician, and he's run the Ryman Prize. He's a world-renowned Alzheimer and dementia disease expert who chairs different fora from the UK to the US to whatever in those areas. But another one of the areas that he's interested in beyond dementia and beyond geriatrics and beyond frailty, because he was one of the inventors of the mathematical model of frailty, is patient-centered outcomes. And I think he was a pioneer in it before PCOR became an actual thing in the pharmaceutical industry. So he's been pushing for these types of outcomes since the mid-90s. And so we're here because he was here and he had these ideas in Nova Scotia to do this. So the company started off as a Nova Scotia-based company. Now with remote workforce, it's really easy for us to span the country. So we do have workforce that spans from Vancouver to Nova Scotia, but we're all still in Canada, which is quite interesting. So Dr. Rockwood's early passion for patient-centered outcomes came from his work in geriatrics and from his work in Alzheimer's disease, where he could see that the disease itself was so incredibly complex and the symptoms and challenges manifested differently with different people depending on how the disease was expressed in each of them. And so to try to measure what was wrong with one person and compare it to what was wrong with somebody else, or to try to measure progress in one person and compare it to progress in somebody else, was really difficult using the same standardized kind of blunt instruments. It's like trying to measure everything in the world only using a ruler this big, or only using a yardstick, or only using something else. And so he was first introduced to goal attainment scaling as a way to capture what was important to people and to measure within person change. So what was meaningful and important to me, to see how that was improving. And then be able to use that to compare different groups. So it's what they call a personalized outcome measure, because what you're doing with goal attainment scaling is you're setting goals for your treatment based on what's important to you and your particular interest and your particular ability. And the next person is doing the same thing. So they're setting their own unique goals and somebody else is setting their own unique goals, which makes sense because we all have different goals for our treatment. But then what you do is you check and see whether people have achieved those goals. And you can just compare the different groups based on whether goals were achieved or not, but not necessarily what the goals were. So I can get into all of that later. But the fact that you're personalizing the endpoint around what each individual thinks is most important is really where the excitement lies. And so from a research perspective, it's really helpful, but he found it helpful in his clinic as well, because once you start talking to people in the language that they have about what's important to them, it changes the entire nature of the conversation. So the physiotherapist is no longer talking about increasing mobility in the right shoulder by 12 degrees or whatever. They're actually talking about how Frank wants to be able to safely lift his grandchild. And then the social worker is talking about that, and the orthopedic surgeon is talking about that, and the geriatrician is talking about that, and everybody's talking about the same thing. And Frank understands what they're talking about because that's what's important to him too. So it really changes the nature of the dialogue between all the clinicians themselves and between the clinician and the patient.